Andrew's my PhD student. He's hardworking and diligent, and he is almost 4 years now into his study of Herstmonceux. He's doing a comparison of the records from Herstmonceux with a neighboring estate called Wartling. And so his paper topic is Land Use and Adaptability During the Little Ice Age, a case study of 2 medieval Sussex manors.
Thank you for that wonderful introduction, Stephen, and for organizing this conference, which is really excellent to be a part of. And I apologize in advance if some of the photos you may have already seen or will see later on in the day. A lot of us are looking at the same material after all. And there's only so many things available on Wikipedia, let's say, that are open license, let's say. So, this paper will discuss the methodological strengths of a comparative study between 2 different manors in environmentally sensitive areas to ascertain how the inhabitants of each reacted to changes in climate. These climatic shocks form the backdrop for the so-called crisis of the early 14th century. Within that context, tenant farmers on the manors of Herstmonceux and Wartling had to do their best to thrive. I've selected these 2 manors for my case study for several reasons. So just to show you quickly, and Christopher had basically the same photo, but this is where East Sussex is, just for your reference. And medieval England is well established as a general outlier in comparison to the continent, but even within the English context, Sussex stands out in many ways as well. And throughout the region of Sussex, and sometimes even within individual manors, subtle differences in topographic conditions, demographics, legal traditions, and farming practices could influence the ability of people to adapt to broader environmental changes. So just as a quick overview, the overall narrative of medieval climate change in the North Atlantic is well known and established. And just for your reference, for people who are not that aware, don't take this as an authoritative graph, it's just to show you basically some of these things that we're talking about. And so the time period, roughly between the 9th and the 14th centuries, has been characterized as a medieval warm period, or more recently, the medieval climate anomaly, which involves seasons as warm as, or even warmer than, the modern era. This was followed by a much colder period known as the Little Ice Age. Recent research has shown, however, that the situation may be more complex than that simple dichotomy. For example, England experienced relatively cold winters in the period from 1260 to 1360, but then some milder seasons between 1395 and 1430. The complexity of establishing general chronological trends is further compounded by regional variability and a relative lack of data for some specific areas. So it would be problematic to infer conclusions about local or even regional climate in Southeast England without fairly comprehensive local indicators or proxy data. And so a multidisciplinary approach must be employed. Unfortunately, this is surprisingly difficult for this part of England. There has been, for example, insufficient dendrochronology work done so far, which is the study of tree rings. The 2 most recent tree ring studies for England used few trees from the southeast and none from East Sussex. Palynology, the study of pollen grains, this very pretty little thing down here, can also be helpful to reconstruct past vegetation. But once again, the data that's been made available for England, it remains remarkably scarce. In fact, the online app for the European pollen database, for example, only has entries for 1 site in Sussex. Other secondary work has been done, but for someone like myself who just wants to access the data, it's surprisingly difficult without being able to contact a palynologist. And so these holes in the scientific record compel us to look for alternative ways to reconstruct the environment in which the inhabitants of medieval Herstmonceux were living. So one of these ways is because, in general, medieval England has a surprisingly rich supply of extant, surviving, documentary sources that highlight information regarding things like precipitation and temperature. These data are first common in the 12th century, and then especially prevalent after 1200. Now, the total production of such documents does decline later on in the 14th and the early 15th centuries, presumably because of widespread societal shocks in that era. However, we do have a numerous source of documentation known as account rolls, manorial account rolls, which can be used to reconstruct medieval English climate. And some very large collections of these documents survive, most notably the Battle Abbey records for this region. And I'm sure later on today, Tim Newfield will be discussing this in more detail about how he's comparing the crop yields from these manors with climatological data to try to establish some of these climate trends. Now, unfortunately, as was hinted at in Christopher's talk, we don't have any of these account rolls for Herstmonceux, apart from an exciting discovery made by Phil Slavin recently, which he kindly made available to us, which gives some insight into this. But, as Christopher was just saying, this does not mean we should give up looking for these documents. He has, of course, compiled a truly impressive collection over the years. But, in the meantime, there are other sources that can be used to reconstruct how people adapted to changes in climate, and maybe even in some different ways than just focusing on the account rolls would allow us to. These documents that I will be focusing on are manorial court rolls, and they have been well studied by generations of English historians to investigate various social changes. Even though the court rolls may not lend themselves to detailed demographic analyses or economic analysis, partly due to the irregularity of surviving documents, especially Herstmonceux is a great example, and the fact that they only list the deaths of adult, predominantly male landholders. And they don't provide the sort of rich economic data that the accounts do. But despite those apparent shortcomings, they can provide valuable information about land use and legal issues in times of environmental change. The manor court operated on the right of landlords to hold court for their tenants, both free and villein, based on the customs of that specific manor. So issues regarding tenures and the lands involved were under the jurisdiction of the manorial lord, and thus very important for life in the local community. All land transactions had to include payments to the court for the appropriate licenses, and then they were recorded in the court books. The court resolved non-violent disputes, regulated the use of common fields, and punished trespassing, among other matters. And so these functions of the court, documented clearly in the court rolls, were always important, but especially so in periods where there may have been uncertainty about the quality of land and its use. And so studies of climatic events for England show that there was seasonal variability, but they have pinpointed several trends that bear mentioning. Severe and frosty winters were common throughout the 13th century, but tended to be accompanied by hot and dry summers. However, this trend gave way to increasingly wet summers, with 1314 and 1318 being especially noteworthy, which, as some of you may know, is the Great Famine era. And so wet seasons like these predictably led to widespread crop failures and increased susceptibility to flooding for low-lying marshland, like that around Herstmonceux and Wartling on the levels. Some evidence for this can be seen by comparing the Nonarum Inquisitiones of 1342 with the Taxatio Ecclesiastica of 1291. When Parliament granted King Edward III 1/9 the value of corn, wool, and lambs in 1342 to help fund his wars, jurors had to go around and assess those values from the previous year. So partly this is based on memory and verbal promises of what they had yielded. And they went around parish by parish and had to explain any discrepancies with the data that had been collected in 1291. And in many cases, there was a noticeable decrease in value reported, most significantly due to a reduction in cultivated land. The findings from the Nonarum, while admittedly problematic, they do show that in Sussex, an estimated 4,000 acres of land had been inundated over the previous half-century, and at least 6,000 arable acres had been abandoned in total over the same period. At Hoo alone, a nearby community, farmers had lost 400 acres to flooding, and land once valued at 11 shillings at another nearby community, Ninfield, was also completely unusable. Both of these communities are only 5 miles from Wartling, or from Herstmonceux, sorry. And even at Wartling, 200 acres of marsh that had once been cultivated was found to be entirely submerged. And so on the surface, these marginal lands, as they may seem, could fit nicely into the larger thesis of M.M. Postan, in which he stated that part of the thesis is that lands are cultivated, and presumably in the reverse order abandoned, in order of the strength of their agricultural assets. In fact, recent research has shown that soils that are difficult to cultivate were not generally abandoned earlier than those that are better for cultivation during late medieval declines in cultivation. But that actually they were affected in similar ways. So people did not abandon them based solely on their value agriculturally. And so the story may be more complex than merely assuming that marginal lands were logically abandoned due to flooding caused by global climate change trends. The situation is, we have to be a little more nuanced than that. And so we need not only to make more detailed conclusions about the impact on the landscape, but also to give agency to the society in which those environmental changes were occurring. Elements that may seem to be outliers could in fact give clues into how communities adapted to or were affected by climate change. So interestingly, Wartling, which had reported that they lost 200 acres to flooding, also reported no overall decline in prosperity during that time period. And even though Hu and Ninfield had lost significant land to flooding, they had also abandoned upland farms as well. So it's not just an issue of being flooded out. Other areas which had lost no land to flooding experienced much more radical prosperity decline than Wartling did, for example. The other issue is the creation of deer parks played just as significant a role for agricultural decline in some of these areas. And so one of the answers for why these exceptions existed may lie in their location. You've already seen this map, it's just to show the weald and the levels and the downs. Research has shown that farms in the weald experienced a period of general stability at that time, in stark contrast to the experiences of people living near the coast or along the South Downs. And so for these reasons, factors like topography become significant for any environmental history of the region. The manors that I'm investigating, Herstmonceux and Wartling, were both balanced between two distinct topographic regions, as you've heard about, the weald and the Pevensey levels. And so the weald is an elevated region between the chalk ridges of the North and South Downs. And it was traditionally relatively heavily wooded, and even still today is one of the more wooded areas of England. And I'll just show you a couple pictures so you can see that they look quite different. The weald is obviously up here and the levels down there. The Pevensey levels, by contrast, is a lowland marsh with fertile soil, but constantly at risk of flooding. And so in this way, people on the levels suffer disproportionately in periods of environmental upheaval. And so as both of these distinct regions were present within the manors of Herstmonceux and Wartling, each tenant thus had very different concerns from other tenants and different priorities based on their location. And so the lords and their officials would have to contend with those different priorities. As an example of the drastic differences, this is an 18th century map that shows general topography. As an example of these differences, the elevation of the present-day castle of Herstmonceux is 13 meters above sea level, while the area just to the south of it, in many areas, is half to 1 meter above sea level, and in some areas directly at sea level. To the north of the castle, part of which is where the park is eventually enlarged and enclosed, stands as high as, basically slopes up to as high as 45 to 50 meters above sea level. So you have a 50-meter difference in elevation just on either side of the castle, basically. And so this fascinating landscape contains some social elements as well that are uncommon compared to the rest of England, namely in terms of demographics and legal traditions, and also some farming practices that I will mention. And all three of these themes can be uncovered by investigating the manorial court rolls. So just as a brief overview, demographics in southeast England differ greatly from some other regions in the country. The nucleated villages found in the Midlands, for example, were virtually unheard of in Sussex, especially in East Sussex. And most people in the Wealden part of the country lived in dispersed settlements, either small hamlets or single farms. Now that's not to say that a reasonably sizable population did not live in the area. In 1086, Domesday Book records that Herstmonceux contained 42 farming households. And the lay subsidy rolls from 1296 record 30 taxpayers on movable goods from the tithing of Herstmonceux, and 31 from Wartling. And that's not the full population, that's just basically tenants who could afford to have movable goods. And so while archaeological excavations can give us some insight into settlement patterns, we can also look for clues in the documentary record. In some areas of dispersed settlement, like the Scottish Isles, one plot of land could well be known to be occupied by the same family for centuries. But in contrast, in many East Anglian communities, they experienced widespread migration, sometimes even more so than in Midland villages. And so the picture for Sussex is less clear, but some sort of prosopographical analysis in the court rolls could hopefully reveal to what extent people moved around in that area. And so if the names and details of families and their tenancy of specific areas can be traced backwards through time, then reasonable inferences could be made to reconstruct the makeup of the settlement when the castle was constructed, or during periods of environmental pressures. And so detailed surveys of the area do exist, or did exist and are lost, which includes the description of the park from 1570 and that lost tenement survey, and also visual representations of all the landholder properties from the 1680s. And you've seen basically other pages of this document. But these plots of land can be georeferenced and then visualized using GIS technology, and then correlated to information we know about the medieval tenants. In fact, just for example, many of the same late medieval surnames are still consistent with ones in the 17th century. And so the location of each family or farm, whether in the Weald or on the levels, near the coast or far from it, can give insight into land use decisions and adaptability during the Little Ice Age. And so this method employs a retrogressive approach familiar to historical geographers and advocated by none other than Mark Bloch, for example. And although it has been employed less often than a progressive approach, in which you take a period of time and move towards now, retrogressive is now and move backwards. And so while it does have its dangers, it does make up for the issue of lacking documentation sometimes, and maybe the only way to be able to trace backwards. An example of one such possible complication, apart from holes in the documentation, is that before the first half of the 14th century, most tenants in the Weald held very small parcels of land. But in the wake of the plague, Black Death, and upheaval throughout the 14th century, surviving landholders took the opportunity to subsume vacant tenements. And so the later tenements are much larger than the previous ones. However, the court rolls can provide information about these transfers, and as Christopher said, the 17th century survey does even provide basically footnotes about which court roll they got it from. Court rolls from the area furthermore describe some ways that farmers sought to improve the soil quality of their land. One of these widespread methods involved adding marl, which is lime-rich mud basically, to fields, which was nevertheless a time-consuming venture. Those tenants with large families to help with the work did very well. Some others used disposable income to hire workers. But many others entered into cooperative marling agreements with other tenants as well. And significantly, this practice was most prevalent on the Wartling Manor in the years 1306 to 1322, when grain prices were especially high. As well, the legal traditions of these communities were shaped by their landscape in interesting ways. Farmers in the Weald may have been generally poorer and stuck with heavy clay soil to work with, but they had free tenure arrangements, which means they only paid a money rent. They did not actually own labor services to the lord. This contrasts with much of the rest of Sussex, where tenant land was held by the Lanes. Inheritance customs in the county differed from most other parts of England as well. Most of Sussex practice ultimogeniture, where inheritance is given to the youngest son, as opposed to the more widely known primogeniture. And interestingly, numerous other manors used partible inheritance, which was more comparable to communities in Kent. Ultimogeniture had certain benefits, most notably that it reduced the fragmentation of tenant holdings that was so common with partible inheritance. Although this strength may have backfired for people who owed heavy rents to the lord, as they could be tied to less productive land, but still owing large rents and labor services. So those with free tenure, presumably like in the Weald, although we don't know enough about that, may have been better able to adapt to drastic changes in agricultural productivity in general. And as revenues began to decline into the 14th century, especially with upheaval from warfare with the French and repeated occurrences of livestock epidemics, some lords increasingly focused on collecting their seigneurial dues. The court rolls show that the lords of Herstmonceux and Wartling were no exception. Many tenants on both manors were living on the edge of subsistence at this time, a situation made even worse by the collection of harriets, which is the practice of giving their best animal to the lord on the death of a tenant. And so these feudal pressures may have influenced other changes in settlement patterns as well. The first half of the 14th century witnessed widespread ascertain, that is, the clearing of woodland for agricultural use. P.F. Brandon even estimates that the area reclaimed during the period actually outnumbers the land lost to flooding that's listed in the Nonar. And so on the surface, this may seem counterintuitive in an era of population and economic decline, not to mention poor yields and flooding due to environmental changes. Mavis May cautions, however, not to see this woodland clearing as evidence of increasing population. Instead, the low rents, weak seigneurial power, and plentiful timber in the Weald may have been a tempting alternative to more fertile land that nevertheless required extensive labor services. And so what we likely see here is a changing of priorities in regards to land use, changes which arose from the interaction of environmental and social considerations. And so I'll just wrap up quickly here. But these case studies of the medieval Herstmonceux and Wartling manors therefore allow us to compare and contrast land use decisions and adaptability over time during an era of drastic environmental pressures. They show us that detailed interdisciplinary studies must necessarily include regional, social, and even topographical analyses in order to fully grasp the environmental history of a site or community. Thank you.